God, I wish I could see you all better, but I heard you great. Well, well, thank you all so much for coming this afternoon to hear me talk about one of my greatest musical passions, the piano music of Maurice Ravel. So, what do I have in store for you today? Well, today I'll be speaking about the manner in which the piano music of Maurice Ravel was played at the time it was written in early 20th century France. I'll be talking about the recordings that Ravel made of his own music and how his performing style as a pianist and the performing style of his colleagues and contemporaries can inform, enliven, and enrich modern performances of this wonderful, entrancing music. You're going to learn about the recording technology that he used, the history behind some of his most famous piano pieces. We'll listen to some recordings, I'll play some musical examples, and then, in a little over a half an hour, I'll play for you one of my favorite pieces Ravel ever wrote, the Valses nobles et sentimentales. Yeah. Let's begin with a brief biography of Ravel. Maurice Ravel was a French composer who lived from 1875 until 1937. Along with Claude Debussy and Eric Satie, he was and remains to this day one of France's most popular and most innovative composers. His music is characterized by its clarity, its intricacy, the harmonic imagination, and the highly formal nature of its architecture. And by formal, I mean he was very interested in compositional forms, most prominently those found in the eras of Mozart and Bach. Now, he's often associated with the Impressionist movement. He's a contemporary of Debussy, that makes sense. Though he and Debussy actually rejected the term, preferring for it to refer to painting specifically. So a more accurate category for Ravel would be to call him a neoclassicist. Neoclassicism in music was a trend particularly prevalent during the interwar period, roughly 1918 till 1939, in which composers returned to the aesthetic principles associated with classicism. What are those principles? Well, namely balance, order, economy, emotional restraint. If you think of the music of Mozart, you think of very simple, highly formal music. Well, that was Ravel's bread and butter. But with neoclassicism, you get all those wonderful formal characteristics of the music from the era of Bach and Mozart, but infused with the melodic, rhythmic, and harmonic vocabulary of the 20th century. This return to older musical forms in the early 20th century France was mainly seen as a response to the perceived formlessness of the Romantic era. The Romantic era mainly occurred predominantly in the 19th century. I first came to know the music of Ravel in the summer between 7th and 8th grade as a student in the Summer Music West program at the San Francisco Conservatory. I played a duet piece for four hands called Ma Mère Louillet, also known as the Mother Goose Suite. I remember thinking how cool it was that there was this composer whose music sounded so modern and yet so classical at the same time. There were tinges of classical music and little suggestions of jazz. It really spoke to me. I didn't really understand why it sounded like that, but I knew I wanted more. So I immersed myself in his piano repertoire, and once I reached the level to be able to play some of this music, I began to voraciously devour as many recordings as I could, and I just couldn't get enough. I was obsessed. I still am obsessed with Ravel, if you haven't noticed. Ravel's harmonic imagination, the lyricism of his melodies, the tight architectural quality of his music, and the beautiful, dazzling virtuosity of his pieces just mesmerized me. By the time I arrived here at UCSC for my undergraduate education, I had listened to several different recordings of the complete piano works of Ravel, everything he wrote for piano. What struck me most, and what I'll mainly be talking about today, was how similarly all of these recordings sounded. The same pieces seemed to be interpreted the same way. Why was that? Usually when you hear a piano piece played by a different artist, you hear, at the very least, subtle little differences in tempo, articulation, dynamics, and so forth. But with Ravel, all the interpretations sounded the same. When I was a kid, I loved Bach and Beethoven. Still do. And when I would listen to my dad's CD collection, I remember thinking how wonderful it was that there were so many different ways the same piece could be played. It was like I got to re-experience a piece that I thought I knew perfectly over and over again for the first time. Different pianists would find these wonderful little nuances to bring out in this intricate and transfixing music. So, what am I going on and on about right now? Well, interpretation. Different musicians interpret the same pieces differently. And in Western classical music, there is another related concept that I'll be talking about today to interpretation, and that is called performance practice. Broadly defined, performance practice is the term applied to musical techniques employed in specific musical genres during specific musical eras. What did Bach or Mozart's music sound like in the 18th century? And how can we reproduce the styles and the playing that were common during that period in history? Well, several key aspects are taken into consideration in this pursuit. These include the technical aspects of playing, such as the stylistic finessing of tempo, what type of articulation of the notes was used, the tuning of the instruments, to name just a few. Historically informed performance ensembles will even play period instruments, which are instruments that are several hundred years old, that come from the period of history of the music that's being played. So you'll see violinists playing Stradivariuses from the 1700s in these ensembles. It's amazing. These instruments often have a different timbre and character than their modern counterparts. So, let's listen to some recordings to illustrate some different approaches to performance practice. One of the most obvious and possibly most controversial examples of a musician giving their own unique take on interpretation and who challenged the perceived rules of performance practice is that of Canadian keyboardist Glenn Gould. Now, Glenn Gould was known primarily as a Bach interpreter. His interpretations were unique, to say the least. First and foremost, the fact that he played Bach almost exclusively on a piano is a departure from an historically accurate performance, in that nearly all of Bach's keyboard music was written either for harpsichord or organ. And the piano, as we know it today, didn't even exist in the lifetime of Bach. There was a nascent version of it. It was much smaller and sounded way different. But Gould did a lot more with the music of Bach than to just play it on an instrument for which it wasn't written. He would play pieces that had been traditionally played at slow or moderate tempos unbelievably fast, and vice versa. He would add really starkly detached notes into phrases where all intuition would tell you that the phrase should be played fluidly. Probably most famously, he was known for audibly humming along to the piano while he played. Anybody who's listened to his recordings knows what I'm talking about. He created quite a stir in the classical music world. Now, while Gould was most famous for his Bach interpretations, he actually recorded several works by Mozart and Beethoven as well. And these recordings really illustrate just how far from the norm he departed and how broad a range of performance practices are possible. So, I'll play you 3 different recordings of the same excerpt from a Mozart piano sonata. This is Mozart's piano sonata in B-flat major, and the first recording is by renowned Mozart interpreter Mitsuko Uchida. So that would be considered a fairly standard interpretation of that piece, the kind that you would hear on the radio or at a concert if you went to one. So that's one example of performance practice. Now let's listen to the same passage played by Richard Fuller, who is an expert in historically informed performance practice, and in this recording he's playing on a piano from Mozart's time. Smaller keyboard, smaller instrument, fewer strings, and you will be able to hear the difference. Quite different, right? You notice the tuning was a little bit different. There's more of a tinny quality to the piano. Let's listen to Gould now. All right. You can see why I liked him as a teenager. So, needless to say, you probably picked up on the rhythmic subtleties, or lack thereof, in each recording. The small little hesitations to highlight new passages or the leaning into particular notes to add expression. These are decisions that a performer makes that deal with both interpretation and performance practice. So, back to Ravel. Normally, one encounters a fairly broad spectrum of interpretation when listening to the music from Ravel's era, that is, the late 19th, early 20th century. But with Ravel, it wasn't the case. Now, I had my own ideas of how this music spoke to me and how I felt it should sound. I think every musician has that happen when they're first engaging with a piece. But everyone else, all these recordings I was listening to, seemed lockstep committed to one interpretation. Why was this? How could this music that seemed to be so boundless in terms of harmony and rhythm and melody have so few pianists really let their imaginations run wild with it? Well, it wasn't until I came here to UCSC as an undergrad that I started to find out. Turns out, Ravel was a bit of a control freak. As I delved deeper into the scores, his biography, and the accounts of his colleagues and contemporaries, I started to read these stories about how Ravel really didn't want his music interpreted at all. He just wanted people to follow what was written in the pages of the score, and the scores are very dense in terms of notation. Every page is jam-packed with dynamic markings, articulation notations, little notes written above passages describing just how he wanted his music to be realized. Possibly the most famous example of Ravel's controlling nature occurred at the Paris Opera in the spring of 1930. I love this story. So, Ravel's most famous composition, Bolero, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, was being performed that evening by none other than Arturo Toscanini, easily one of the most brilliant and well-known conductors of the early 20th century, and legendary not only for his painstaking perfectionism, but also his tyrannical temper. Ravel was seated in the audience at the performance, and Toscanini took the tempo of Bolero notably faster than Ravel had indicated in the score. The performance was met with an enthusiastic standing ovation. This was a groundbreaking work, you'll have to remember. It was the one that really put Ravel on the map, especially to American audiences. Despite this standing ovation, when Toscanini ceremoniously gestured towards Ravel, as conductors often do when the composer is in-house, Ravel remained motionless, visibly irritated. And normally, a composer stands at this moment, not Ravel. When Toscanini and Ravel met in the green room afterwards, the atmosphere had to have been tense. Accounts vary as to what exactly was said after Ravel's obvious slight. One description contends that Ravel asserted, "It's too fast," to which Toscanini replied, "You do not know anything about your own music." It was the only way to save the work. To which Ravel retorted, "Then do not play it." Snap. I remember reading that when I was about 19 years old and my heart sinking. And I was just like, oh man, does this mean I can't find my own voice in this music? It would make Ravel mad. It really felt that way initially, but I was determined to learn more. So I did more research and reading, and I quickly found that the question of how to approach Ravel's music had been a consistent source of confusion and disagreement among both academics and performers alike for decades. But despite the architectural nature of Ravel's composition and the seemingly rigid interpretational boundaries he penned into the score, the music remained so intriguing to realize and ripe with expressive potential. And I thought to myself, well, one can safely assume that Ravel, a deeply sensitive and emotional man, never held the intention to narrow the expressive range of his works. Yet, a formidable challenge remains when approaching the score. How does one ascertain and adhere to the composer's intent in terms of tempo, rubato, dynamics, and pedaling, while remaining true to his intentions? Where are the lines drawn in terms of all of those aforementioned expressive qualities? How does one interpret Ravel? Fortunately, we have two invaluable sources to help in this pursuit. You see, Ravel's life overlapped with the emergence of the world's first recording technologies. Now, most people, when they think of the earliest recordings of music ever made, they think of the wonderful old crackly gramophone recordings emanating from old record players or Victrolas, if any of you still know what that is. I know some of you do. However, Ravel's piano playing was never actually captured in audio format. But in the first years of the 20th century, there was another, more popular recording medium, because audio recordings were so rough back then. And that other medium is the player piano roll. In 1912, Ravel, along with several other musical giants of the Parisian music scene, recorded on a far more sophisticated iteration of the normal player piano called the Veltamignon reproducing piano system. We'll talk about that in a minute. The other really valuable source for understanding about how Ravel wanted his music played is the anecdotal testimony of one Vlado Perlmutter, who Ravel once described as his favorite interpreter of his piano music. This guy was a virtuoso pianist. Let's talk about player piano recordings first. Now, I could literally talk for 2 hours about these because I love it so much, but I want you to remain awake. So, we'll summarize. What exactly is a player piano recording? Well, first, it's important to note that the term player piano is more of an umbrella term that refers to several different technologies. The most common player pianos seen today look just like an upright piano and contain a piano roll mechanism front and center, as shown in this image. You put in different piano rolls and the instrument plays different pieces. But the recording technology that Ravel used, as I said before, utilized a different, more intricate technology and was called a reproducing piano. So we have player piano and reproducing piano. And understanding the difference between those two is crucial. The player piano, put simply, served more as an interactive musical playback device. The paper rolls didn't represent recordings of an actual person playing. Rather, those rolls were formatted by technicians, either by hand or machine in an assembly line. Reproducing pianos, like the Veltamignon reproducing piano system, utilized more complex internal mechanisms, as I said, and had separate units that actually recorded pianists as they played and produced rolls from that. Those rolls were hence able to capture and recreate with remarkable accuracy for the time those actual performances of these giants who had been around since the 19th century. Many of these people had heard long-dead famous composers like Chopin play, Brahms. This was a window into the past, literally. So these roles were able to give a faithful representation of the dynamics, the phrasing, the tempo shifts, the style of a lost performance practice tradition. This is what Ravel recorded on. And the fidelity of the reproduction, even with some small shortcomings, still provides a very accurate representation of his performing style, and therefore qualifies it not only as a source of the most accurate piano roll recordings, but as one of the most relevant sources for interpretational analysis. As mentioned before, the other valuable source for learning about how Ravel played is the testimony of this man, Vlado Perlmutter, one of Ravel's most trusted collaborators. A little bit about Perlmutter. Perlmutter was born in 1904 and was accepted into the Paris Conservatoire at the young age of 10, where he received a first-rate musical education under the tutelage of such musical giants as Alfred Cortot and Moritz Muszkowski. After his graduation at age 15, Perlmutter went on to become a pianist of international repute, enjoying a career that spanned nearly 8 decades. He was 98 years old when he died. In fact, he was the teacher of a former faculty member here at UCSC. Yeah. His early musical career flourished during an incredibly important time in French musical culture, in which he was exposed to some of the most influential musical figures of the early 20th century, including Debussy, Fauré, and Ravel. In addition to bearing a striking resemblance to Ravel, Perlmutter was a performer whom Ravel trusted. How did that come to be? Well, after meeting him briefly in 1927, Perlmutter was coerced by his friends to send Ravel a letter requesting coachings in his pursuit to learn all of Ravel's piano music, every piece, to which Ravel obliged. Perlmutter then spent a 4-month period studying the entirety of Ravel's works for piano solo in exhaustive detail with Ravel at Ravel's house, directly from the mouth of the composer. This period of study culminated in 2 public recitals later that year in 1930, in which Perlmutter performed the complete piano works of Ravel with Ravel in attendance at the recital. Perlmutter would repeat this feat 2 more times, once at the ripe old age of 83 to commemorate the 50-year anniversary of Ravel's passing, and also in 1950, and this is the relevant performance. In 1950, Perlmutter supplemented his performances with detailed accounts of his experiences with Ravel in a radio interview with Hélène Jodin-Morange, famous violinist. With score in hand, Perlmutter guided listeners phrase by phrase through every piano piece Ravel wrote, sharing all of the composer's insights into effective realization of his music. The transcripts of this interview were eventually published in a book entitled Ravel According to Ravel, and serve as another invaluable source to anyone in pursuit of an historically informed approach to Ravel's music. So, let's listen to some recordings and have a look at what Ravel told Vlado Perlmutter about how he wanted his music played. We will begin with a recording of Ravel's enchanting Sonatine in F-sharp minor. Originally composed for a competition held by the Anglo-French magazine, the Paris Weekly Review, the Sonatine displays Ravel's penchant for formalism and irony. Along with the piece's strict adherence to classical sonata form, as you would find in the music of Mozart, Ravel infuses several modern attributes into this piece, such as chromaticism, crunching dissonances, the pervasive use of 7th chords. It's really a very enchanting work. So first, let's hear an excerpt of Vlado Perlmutter playing it. This is just a little bit of the first movement here. Beautiful piece. So, what do you notice about that recording? The first thing is a really clear projection of the top voice of the melodic line. Promoter was known for that, really, really letting the melodies sing. Also, the other thing you notice is a really steady metronomic tempo, which makes sense. Promoter commented on the Sonatine, saying, "The Sonatine is nearly always played too fast, and if you hear other recordings of it, it's played quite a bit quicker than that." Ravel insisted that the tempo should not be too hurried, and apart from the tempo, which Ravel wanted to be strict and without rubato, he was very concerned about the exact length of the semiquaver in the second theme, which I'll show you what he's talking about real quick. That note right there. So if I were to play this passage metronomically, really steadily in time, it would sound like this. Right? When you hear Ravel play it, you're going to notice he puts this little stress on that note. Right? That's not written in the score. So, already Ravel breaking his own rules. Let's hear Ravel play it now. Remember, he wanted steady tempo. So, the most striking feature of Ravel's performance in the opening bars of the first movement, which, by the way, was given a moderate tempo marking, is his almost manic tendency to accelerate through difficult passages, departing well beyond the indicated tempo of 108 beats per minute equals the eighth note. It would seem that the ever-paradoxical Ravel's impulse to defy convention, something he was known for, included that of his own rules. These tempo discrepancies can be a little jarring at first. It probably would have been hard for you to tap your foot to that, right? However, upon further listening, a correlation becomes apparent, not only between tempo, the speed at which he played, and dynamics, the volume with which he played, but tempo and phrase as well. The gradual swell from soft to loud in measures 5 and 10, which I'll play a little bit of in a second, is accompanied by corresponding accelerations in tempo. And in the areas where the melody moves upward in register, there are similar increases in tempo, speeding up. It would seem that Ravel utilized tempo, phrasing, and dynamics all in tandem with one another to push phrases forward and produce flourishing effects. This is evident on the second beats of measures 9 and 10 as well. So instead of playing metronomically in tempo, here's the passage I'm talking about. That little bit right there. Instead of playing that metronomically in tempo, which at 108 beats per minute is notably slower, it's about here. He actually reflects the blossoming quality of the phrase with a corresponding increase in speed. So you'll notice that when he gets to this part, he doesn't just play it straight. He doesn't go. He leads into it a little bit slowly. So the phrase is pushed forward by the tempo. Conversely, Ravel utilizes decelerations in tandem with decreases in dynamics to emphasize the winding down of phrases. Here's that passage again, played metronomically. And here's how Ravel does it. So when he travels downward, slows down a little bit. And then when he travels upward, slow down, speed up, slow down. Gives the phrase a landing quality, right? This tendency is present throughout the entire performance of the entire sonatine. At first I thought it was a malfunction in the reproducing piano technology. It's understandable, it's over 100 years old. But essentially Ravel uses tempo to highlight the shapes of phrases by manipulating it to correspond to dynamic shifts and the upward and downward movement of the melody. If you take a look at this excerpt, this is further illustrating what I'm talking about. From the score above, I have a little graph which represents the speed of Ravel's playing by the thick black line above the staves. So you can see there's those numbers there. That's the BPM. That's the beats per minute right there. And if you look carefully, you can see as the melody, even if you don't read music, I've got an arrow showing you, the melody in the upper stave, that's actually it's towards the middle there. When it goes up, and the big circle I have there is a crescendo, you can see on the graph above, he speeds up. The term I came up with to describe this relationship is correlative expression, since tempo, dynamics, and phrasing all have a direct correlation to one another in Ravel's playing. Here's one other example. So you can see there's a big dip in tempo right there above the pianissimo sign that's circled there. So pianissimo, subito, that means suddenly quiet. And there's this drop off the cliff in tempo there. Okay. Another of the most salient features of Ravel's performing style is his pervasive habit of arpeggiating blocked chords. So what does arpeggiating mean? Well, a blocked chord is when you play 3 or more notes simultaneously, all at the same time. When you arpeggiate them, that means you roll them from the bottom note up. Now, this is often notated in scores with a vertical squiggly line, right? But Ravel does this all over the place, even when it's not notated. This actually, I found out later, is a stylistic nuance associated with Romantic era piano performance practice. And in several instances, there is really no discernible difference between Ravel's notation of those chords and this stylistic tendency. The spreading of chords can be found at numerous points. The first being after the caesura in measure 3. So this is when the initial melody comes in. That's the melody, right? So the first time he plays it straight. All of the notes attack at the same time. Second time, so he gives a little like that. That's not written in the score. This highlighting effect recurs at several other points throughout measures 5 through 12 to emphasize the strong beats and gestural flourishes of the melody. In fact, it's hard to pick up on the first few times you hear it, but in that other passage I play, he does it there too. He does them really quick though, so it's hard to catch them, but I've listened to that recording about 10,000 times, so I heard it. Also prominent is Ravel's use of dislocation. Dislocation. So this is a practice of rhythmically separating the melody, typically in the upper register, from the bass or accompaniment parts as an expressive highlighting effect. Ravel's use of this technique often coincides with tenutos, which usually means to play a note at its full value or lean into it, and can be heard most prominently from measures 20 through 22. That's this passage. So I'm playing this straight right now. You may have caught that Ravel went like this. Brought that accompaniment note in first, literally making the melody note late to the party. But it actually sings out and is a lot more noticeable that way. That's prevalent throughout 19th century performance practice. Ravel and Perlmutter's recordings have some areas of similarity, but by and large, they represent opposite ends of the interpretational spectrum. Ravel's exuberant surges in tempo, rolling blocked chords, and expressive dislocation of the melody are all idiomatic of Romantic-era pianism and stand in stark contrast to Perlmutter, whose colorful yet controlled interpretation is more akin to a style of playing one might find in modern recordings. In several respects, Ravel's assertions to Perlmutter during their time together in terms of dynamics, phrasing, tempo, and rubato stand in complete contradiction to the manner in which Ravel actually plays, down to nearly every last detail. The most consistent point of overlap between Ravel and Perlmutter's interpretations are worth noting, however, if we're going to draw from these sources to figure out how we can enrich this music in modern times. What are the points of overlap? The major point of overlap is their tendency to highlight form through manipulation of tempo. Now, this is achieved by the approach just discussed, using tempo to highlight the form, the shape of phrases, but you also hear in these recordings the earmarking of the ends of phrases and the beginnings of new phrases by slowing down or releasing the pedal before the beginning of a new phrase, which simulates a breath. That gives you a clear indication that this phrase is ending and the next one is beginning. Another approach is by never playing a repeated phrase, of which there are many in sonata form, the same way twice. So, let's move forward now to the final section of my little lecture today and talk about the piece I'll be playing for you in just a minute. The Valses noble et sentimentale. This is one of my favorite pieces of music ever written. I'm so happy to be playing it for you later. Composed in 1911, this is a set of 8 short waltzes containing a unique synthesis of impressionistic and modernistic elements. The title translates, as you could probably guess, to noble and sentimental waltzes, which, as you listen to them, will seem like a bit of a misnomer, since the words noble or sentimental hardly suffice to describe the emotional range of these pieces. The work was first performed by its dedicatee, Louis Aubert, at a memorable 1911 concert of the Société Musicale Indépendante, the Independent Musical Society. This was an organization co-founded by Ravel. One of the things that made this particular concert unique was that the identities of the composers of the works performed that day were kept secret from the audience and the other composers in attendance. This was done with the aim of soliciting a more honest response to the music. Ravel's waltzes proved a polarizing work, eliciting a mixture of applause, boos, and catcalls throughout the performance, not uncommon at that time. In the interest of time, I will focus primarily on just 2 of the 8 movements of this cycle, highlighting their formal and stylistic attributes as we go. Here is an excerpt from the boisterous first movement as played by Vlado Perlmutter. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry. Here it is. I had audio issues earlier. I was like, is that not there? Oh my God. Okay, here it is. So I do realize that the next recording I was going to play is missing, so I'm just going to play you a few bars of it real quick here. All right? There you go. This is a little bit of the third movement. gives you an idea of the emotional range of these pieces. You have really exuberant movements, you have really delicate and dull-like movements like that one. Though the waltzes have relatively few technical hurdles, the challenge of this work lies in calculated execution of the rhythm, giving careful attention to each movement's formal properties and the idiomatic writing of the waltz genre. Ravel's waltzes epitomize several elements of this popular genre, with a stylistic range that stretches from the exuberant gestures of Strauss's dance hall works to the more intimate lyricism of Chopin's shorter character pieces. Bearing this in mind, a wide array of stylistic nuances are available to the performer. The stylistic, I skipped a part, hold on, sorry. Okay, one of the most salient of these nuances is an anticipation of the second beat. Now, we all know that waltzes are in 3, right? Now, the anticipated second beat, which I'll play a recording of to illustrate to you, is characteristic of the Viennese waltz. It's a particular style of waltz. When you think of Strauss, that's often the Viennese waltz. But normal waltz rhythm, you think, right? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. However, in Viennese waltzes, there is a lilt in the rhythm by anticipating the second beat. That is, you're bringing it in just slightly early, which gives it kind of this elongated feel. And there's probably no better example I could find on YouTube than this glorious performance of Schubert's waltzes. This is a piece that Schubert wrote called the Valse Noble, the noble waltzes, and actually Ravel cited these as his inspiration for the work that I'll play later. You get a sense of what I'm talking about. It's meant to mimic the dance steps of the waltz, which, if you're really doing these beautiful gestures, they're not going to be lockstep metronomically in time, right? Where am I going? I'm going back to the piano. So that stylistic finessing of the tempo, that leaning into the second beat, can be applied to these Ravel waltzes I'm about to play. I think they're particularly effective in those opening cluster chords that you heard at the beginning of the first movement. Now, these chords are really dissonant, right? And if you play them too metronomically, I think they get monotonous. So that would sound like this. They're cool, but listen if you apply the Viennese waltz leaning into the second beat. I think that makes it so much more interesting to listen to, right? Okay, change the slide. Okay, so what are some unifying themes throughout these waltzes? Well, a detailed analysis of the score reveals several key motifs and rhetorical devices that recur under the surface of each movement, both of which, when emphasized, can serve to enhance the formal characteristics of the set. We know that Ravel liked form being accentuated. The most frequently occurring of these devices is the sigh motif. So what is the sigh motif? Well, it takes several different forms in these pieces. Basically, a sigh motif is a downward or upward movement between two notes, with the first note being emphasized, like this. You can go up as well. And it kind of simulates a The first obvious occurrence of this motif happens in the upper melody of the right hand in measures 33 through 34 of the first movement. These descending motifs are occasionally answered by retracing the psi motif back upwards to its destination note, which happens in the left hand of this very section I was just playing. So downward psi motifs tend to have a melancholy feel to them, and upward psi motifs tend to have more tension associated with them. This motif recurs countless times in every movement of these waltzes. I literally find a new one every time I sit down to score, which is why I love these pieces so much. Always something new to discover. What is another recurring theme? So if you remember that melody that I played from the third movement right there, so we have a step down and then a leap down. This happens countless times. I actually didn't even start to discover these until about 2 months ago. This motif recurs in every single movement after its first appearance. All right, so that was the third movement. Here's where it shows up in the fourth movement. I'll play a bar to lead into it. There it is. It happens 3 other times in that movement. Here's the fifth waltz. Now it's on offbeats there, so I actually only spotted that one just recently. Here's one from the sixth waltz. Catch it? Listen again. And here's one from the seventh waltz, which has by far the most. I think there were 11 quotations of this the last time I checked. Here it goes. So that is just an example of Ravel's formal and structural brilliance. So, to summarize, the manner of playing found in both Ravel and Permuter's recordings, while certainly distinct from one another, reveals an approach to interpretation which is centered around manipulation of tempo to reflect the gestures and dynamics of phrases. In the case of the Valse noble et sentimentale, utilizing the rhythmic nuances that are consistent with the idiom of the waltz enables the pianist to demonstrate Ravel's ironic juxtaposition and harmonic freedom within traditional forms. That's what he was known for doing. He took waltzes, I mean, what more storied form is there than the waltz, and then put all this crazy modern harmony in it. He's a total ironist. Through this approach, a performer of Ravel is able to highlight the formal attributes of the music, as well as enhance the unique expressive qualities of their own playing in a manner that is consistent with the composer's performance style. Despite the fact that Ravel once told his lifelong friend, virtuoso pianist Marguerite Long, no relation, open quote, "I do not ask that one interpret my music, but simply that one play it." Despite the fact that Ravel said that, Ravel was not opposed to individuality in performances of his music. It's obvious. His own playing demonstrates this. What is more likely is that he wanted interpretations to demonstrate an understanding of the formal characteristics of his music, as well as pay homage to the genres represented. And with that, I'd like to thank you so much for your time and attention. And I'll now close our afternoon with a performance. Before I begin, I just want to let you know that this is a multi-movement work, so I'm going to humbly request that you resist the impulse to applaud in between the movements, should you feel it, and save your enthusiasm until I reach the end. Thank you again, and I now present to you Ravel's Valse noble et sentimentale.